The rain in Savannah that night wasn't just rain. It was a weeping thing, a fury that clawed at the slate roofs and sent Spanish moss swaying like a procession of grieving widows. Amidst that mournful howl, the text from Sarah Jenkins, a 32-year-old kindergarten teacher, lit up Detective Jack Riley's phone like a distress flare from a sinking ship. "Come to the house. I'm scared." Just 6 short words, but they landed in the gut of the seasoned detective with the weight of a tombstone. She didn't say what she was scared of. And that kind of fear, the shapeless kind that festers in a sweltering southern night, was the worst kind of all. The next morning, as the first weak rays of sun fought through a blanket of gray humidity, Riley stepped across the threshold of 12A Abercorn Street. The house wasn't just old, it felt rotted from the inside out. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster, of decaying wood, and something else, something cloyingly sweet and foul, like magnolia blossoms mixed with grave dirt. The silence was so profound Riley could hear the blood pulsing in his own ears. It was the silence of a place where something terrible had finished its work. The beam of a forensic flashlight cut through the gloom, painting a scene of such surreal horror that it would be burned into Riley's memory for years. On the cracked, patterned tiles of the living room, a pool of blood had spread, but it wasn't the familiar crimson or the brownish black of dried blood. It was a perfect viscous black, like crude oil, and it gave off a faint, cloying odor of rot and cold earth. A young officer, gloved and curious, reached out to test its consistency. He snatched his hand back as if burned, his face paling. "It's ice cold," he stammered. The thermostat on the wall read 78 degrees Fahrenheit, but a palpable chill radiated from that impossible black pool. Sarah Jenkins's body lay face down on a rough sisal rug. Her long damp hair was not merely matted with rainwater, it was intricately braided with other strands of hair. Strands that were dry, brittle, and impossibly long, with the silver-white color of extreme age, as if some ancient crone had sat there for hours, weaving her own dead hair into that of the victim. Her arms were stretched forward, not in a desperate grasp, but in a posture of final, ritualistic supplication. Her right hand was clenched tight around a scrap of thick, scarlet-colored cotton. Her left hand clutched a small, tarnished St. Jude medal, its surface worn smooth with time. Beside the body lay a small hammer. Its wooden handle was dark and polished, as if from the sweat of generations. Its silver-colored head was stained with fresh blood, but under the focused beam of a UV light, faint, intricate symbols could be seen etched into the metal, ancient sigils worn nearly away by time. The blood spatter on the wall wasn't a random spray. It had formed a grotesque, uncanny shape. It looked like an eye, wide open and staring, watching the intruders in its domain. In the kitchen, a pot of gumbo sat cold on the stove. Everything seemed normal, a life interrupted, until a sharp-eyed detective noticed something floating on the surface next to a bay leaf. A few delicate, pinkish-white petals, oleander, a flower beautiful to look at, but lethally poisonous. A flower used in folk rituals, not in cooking. Riley's investigation became less of a hunt for a killer, and more of a battle against the suffocating unreason of the house. He started with the locals. The first was old Martha, who ran the corner store and had sheltered from the storm under her awning. She hadn't just heard a crash and a bang. When Riley pressed her, her eyes widened with a fear that was clearly not an act. She swore that cutting through the wail of the storm, she'd heard a woman's laughter, a high, tinkling laugh, but utterly devoid of warmth. It lasted only a moment, then was cut off by Sarah Jenkins's own terrified scream. And then a heavy, wet thud, like a sack of wet cement hitting the floor. Then nothing. The next lead was a business card for an antique shop, belonging to a Julian Croft. It was found in Sarah's purse, which lay just outside the front door. As Riley lifted the card with a pair of tweezers, a current of inexplicable cold shot up his arm. Under the UV light, a faint smudge on the card resolved into a clear image. It wasn't lipstick. It was a small, hand-drawn symbol, a circle with a dot in its center, identical to one of the sigils on the hammer. Julian Croft was brought in for questioning. The typically suave, well-dressed antiques dealer was ashen-faced and trembling. He admitted he had feelings for Sarah, But he swore on his life he wasn't there as a lover. He was there to warn her. He spoke in a hushed, terrified voice about the Lady in Scarlet, a local legend, a ghost story told to scare tourists, the spirit of a woman betrayed by her husband who had hanged herself in that very house a century ago. She was said to wear a scarlet silk dress. He said the house was a place of sorrow. He himself, passing by late one night, had seen a figure in red standing motionless on the second-floor balcony, staring down with what looked like hollow sockets. The St. Jude medal in Sarah's hand, he admitted, was from him, a charm for a lost cause. The reports from the forensics lab only deepened the mystery. DNA analysis on the scarlet fabric from Sarah's hand yielded an astonishing result. Not only did it not match anyone in the database, the fabric itself was dated to the early 1920s. It was antique silk, not from a modern coat, but from an old hand-stitched dress, a scarlet silk dress. But the most chilling discovery came from the victim's phone. The text, "Come to the house, I'm scared," hadn't been sent from an unknown number. It had been sent from her own secondary phone, a burner she used for private calls. The call log revealed something that made the hair on Riley's arms stand up. At 8:45 p.m., Sarah Jenkins had called her own number, a call that lasted exactly 3 seconds immediately before the text was sent. As if someone else had used her hand to call and text herself, or as if she had done so in a state of absolute mindless terror. The testimony of the next-door neighbor, a timid woman named Mrs. Gable, added another layer of the impossible. She heard Sarah cry out from the second floor, "Don't do this!" But then, Mrs. Gable insisted, the scream that followed wasn't from one person. She swore it was 2 female voices screaming in perfect, horrifying unison. One was Sarah's, full of fear. The other was higher, a piercing, ghostly wail. Immediately after that dual scream, a loud bang echoed through the wall and the house fell silent. Finally, the physical evidence materialized. Fingerprints on the hammer's handle. Muddy footprints at the back door. Security footage from a nearby bar showing a man in a striped jacket hurrying away from the direction of the house. Everything pointed to one person. Ethan Cole, a 35-year-old graphic designer who worked at a print shop downtown, a former classmate of Sarah's husband Mark, a man who, by all accounts, had been quietly obsessed with Sarah for years. But when Riley's team stormed the print shop and took Ethan into custody, they weren't met with the cold defiance of a killer. They were met with the blank-eyed terror of a puppet whose strings had just been cut. His body shook uncontrollably. His confession, when it came, was not the story of a murder. It was the testimony of a man who had stared into hell. Ethan Cole sobbed that he had loved Sarah since college, a quiet, hopeless kind of love. He knew the stories about 12A Abercorn, about the Lady in Scarlet. He believed them. He was afraid for Sarah's safety. "I didn't want to kill her," he cried, his face a mess of tears and snot. I just wanted to protect her. I got a charm from a woman in the Low Country. I went there last night to try and convince her to leave that godforsaken house." According to Ethan, when he entered through the back door, he found Sarah on the phone with her husband, her face pale with terror. He heard her say into the phone, "She's here again." And then, the temperature in the room plummeted. Ethan swore he saw a shimmering, translucent figure in a scarlet dress materialize behind Sarah, a tangible ghost. "The ghost, it turned and looked at me," Ethan whispered, his eyes wide with remembered horror. "It had no eyes, just these dark, empty pits." It pointed a long, bony finger at the hammer on the table. I felt my arm go cold, like it wasn't mine anymore. It moved on its own. I picked up the hammer. I just remember swinging and a scream. But it wasn't just Sarah's voice. It was both of them, screaming as one. He panicked, threw his blood-stained jacket in a trash can and fled. He claimed it was the ghost itself that tore a piece from its own spectral dress and pressed it into Sarah's hand, a token of its victory, a mark of ownership. Detective Riley closed the case file. Ethan Cole was charged with first-degree murder. The physical evidence was airtight. The fingerprints, the footprints, the fabric from his jacket, the confession. On paper, it was a slam dunk. Julian Croft and Mark Jenkins were cleared, but they would forever live with their own ghosts. Julian would know that there are some shadows that no amount of money or charm can ward off. Mark would never know if his angry phone call had been the final push that awakened the fury of a spirit that had waited a century for a new vessel. Justice of a sort was served, but Riley knew the true killer was still there, bound to the house, to the hammer, and to 100 years of hate. The last night before the house was to be sealed indefinitely, Riley went back alone. He didn't go inside. He just stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the dark, silent facade. The rain was gone, but the air was still heavy, pregnant with unspoken things. And then he heard it. A whisper carried on the humid night air, seeming to come from the house itself. A high female voice, ethereal and cold, uttering a single word. Scared, 12A Abercorn Street had claimed a new soul, and now it was waiting, because love doesn't always lead to happiness. Sometimes it festers into tragedy. And hatred never really dies. It just sleeps, waiting for the next broken heart to wake it up. Riley shuddered, turning away, but he knew a part of him would be forever left behind, trapped in the oppressive darkness of that house. The case was closed, but the horror story was just beginning. In the days that followed, sleep offered Riley no escape. The image of the swirling black blood, the dead woman's hair braided with the hair of a ghost, the watching eye on the wall, they played on a loop in his mind. He had to know more. He buried himself in the city archives. The records showed that 12A Abercorn Street was originally built for a wealthy cotton merchant named Silas Croft. Nearly a century ago, his wife, Eleanora Croft, had hanged herself from the second-floor balcony. The cause of death listed in the official report was postpartum melancholy. But the old-timers in the historic district told a different story. They whispered that Silas was a philanderer, that he had brought his mistress, a young singer, into their home, and that he had driven Eleanora to her doom. She died wearing a scarlet silk dress, a wedding gift from her husband. After her death, Silas sold the house at a loss and vanished. Their infant daughter also disappeared from the records. A chill, more profound than any he'd felt in the house, snaked its way up Riley's spine. The parallels between Eleanora's story and Sarah's were too perfect to be a coincidence. Two women betrayed or believing themselves to be betrayed. Two tragic deaths in the same cursed space. This was not a random haunting. He sought out a man whose name was only spoken in hushed tones, Elias Vance, a local historian and folklorist who lived surrounded by dusty books and strange artifacts. After listening to Riley's entire account, from the ice-cold blood to Ethan Cole's possession-laced confession, Vance was silent for a long time. He lit a pipe, the sweet smell of cherry tobacco filling the small room, then spoke in a low, raspy voice. "That house isn't just haunted, detective. It has become a vessel. A cage for rage. Eleanora's rage has festered for so long it has become a sentient thing, a spiritual predator. It seeks out new hosts, women who resonate on the same frequency of despair, jealousy, and heartache. Sarah Jenkins, with the cracks already forming in her marriage, was, unfortunately, the perfect instrument. Vance explained that the phenomena at the crime scene were all part of a ritual. The swirling black blood was the physical manifestation of concentrated psychic energy. The braiding of the hair was an act of assimilation, the spirit attempting to remake the victim in its own image. The hammer wasn't just a weapon, it was a conduit, an object already stained with past violence and hatred now reawakened. And the dual scream Mrs. Gable heard was the exact moment Sarah's soul was overpowered, her body hijacked by the vengeful entity. Ethan Cole, in this dark play, was merely a prop, a knife held by an invisible hand. "Detective," Vance said, his dark eyes locking onto Riley's, "you've arrested the man who held the knife, but the murderer is still at large, and it's hungry. It has tasted vengeance again, and it will not be satisfied." The old man's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Riley returned to his precinct, a heavy weight on his soul. He looked at the caseboard, at the face of Ethan Cole pinned in the center. He felt a pang of guilt. He had jailed a man who, while legally responsible, was in essence another victim. That night his phone rang. It was Mark, Sarah's husband. His voice was a frantic, terrified squeak. "Detective, I think I saw her. I saw Sarah. She was standing across the street from my house wearing a red dress. Riley floored it, arriving at Mark's suburban home in minutes. He found him huddled in a corner, pale and shaking. He pointed a trembling finger at his front window. She was right there, staring at me, and then she smiled. Riley looked outside. There was nothing, just the quiet tree-lined street. But as he turned back to Mark, he saw something on the collar of the man's shirt. A single, dried oleander petal, identical to the ones from the pot of gumbo. The blood in Riley's veins turned to ice. The entity was not confined to 12A Abercorn. It was following the living. It was continuing its hunt. Riley knew he had to do something. He couldn't let another tragedy happen. He went back to Elias Vance, practically begging for help. Vance sighed, the weight of ages in his expression. He said the only way to break the cycle was to uncover the buried truth and perform a ritual to appease the spirits. They needed to find what happened to Eleanora's child and expose the real cause of her death. A new investigation began, this one into a century-old crime. Riley and Vance pored over brittle newspapers and faded land deeds. They spoke to the descendants of the families who had lived in the neighborhood. At last they found him, the great-grandson of a carpenter who had worked for Silas Croft. And with him, they found the family's dark secret, passed down through generations. Eleanora Croft did not kill herself. She was murdered by her husband. In a fit of jealous rage, Silas had bludgeoned her with that same small hammer, then staged the scene to look like a hanging. Their infant daughter had witnessed the murder and begun to wail. To silence her, the monster had drowned his own child in a wash basin. He buried them both under the floorboards of the living room and had his carpenter lay a new floor over them that very night before he called the authorities. Everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The entity wasn't just one spirit, it was two, a mother and child, the child's laughter, the infantile crying that must have been on that 3-second phone call. It was their agony, their rage, fused together into a single, powerful and malevolent force. It hated philandering men, and it was pathologically jealous of any woman who possessed the happiness it had been denied. Disgust and fury rose in Riley. He immediately had his team run a trace on Silas Croft. The man was long dead, but his bloodline continued. His crimes, however, had been buried with him. Armed with the truth, Riley and Vance prepared to confront the past. They obtained a court order and, with a team of forensic anthropologists and a priest Vance knew, they entered 12A Abercorn and began to excavate the living room floor. Just as the old story claimed, beneath the tile and century-old concrete they found two skeletons, a large one and a small one locked in a skeletal embrace. The moment the bones were exposed to the air, the entire house seemed to groan in protest. A sudden wind howled through the sealed windows and the portable floodlights flickered wildly. From the darkest corner of the room, a shape began to coalesce. A translucent figure of a woman in a tattered scarlet dress, her face a mask of rage, and beside her the shimmering outline of a small child. A silent scream ripped through the psychic atmosphere of the room, a wave of pure agony that made everyone stumble back. Riley fought to stay on his feet, feeling an invisible pressure crushing his chest. He stared directly at the apparition and shouted, his voice echoing in the unholy silence. Eleanora Croft, the truth is known. Silas's crime is no longer a secret. Let go. Be at peace. The spectral figure seemed to freeze. The rage on her face slowly dissolved, replaced by a look of infinite sorrow. She looked at Riley, then down at the unearthed bones of herself and her child. A tear of black ectoplasm traced a path down her spectral cheek. The psychic scream faded into a soft, heartbreaking sob. The priest began to chant in Latin. The warm glow of candlelight spread through the room, pushing back the oppressive cold. The figures of Eleanora and her child began to fade, growing more transparent with each passing moment until they dissolved completely into the still air. The sobbing ceased. The oppressive weight lifted. The cloying smell of rot was replaced by the clean scent of old wood and dust. The house at 12 Abercorn Street was finally quiet. It was cleansed. The bones of mother and child were given a proper burial. The story made minor headlines, a historical curiosity. For Riley, it was the end of the most terrifying chapter of his life. He thought he had won. He thought he had brought peace. He had only unlatched the cage. A year passed. Life for Detective Riley found a new, quieter rhythm. The memory of the Lady in Scarlet faded into a chilling but distant war story. Then a new case landed on his desk, and the quiet was shattered. A young artist, new to Savannah, was found dead in her downtown loft. A single precise stab wound to the heart. No sign of forced entry, no weapon at the scene, but on her easel was a nearly finished painting. It depicted an old, beautiful house with the number 12A on the door, and on its second-floor balcony stood the faint figure of a woman in a scarlet dress, a benevolent smile on her face. The blood drained from Riley's face. He rushed to the scene. The loft was a modern, sterile space, miles from the historic district, but the air inside was unnaturally cold, and on the floor, next to the body, Riley found something that made his soul ache, a single dried oleander petal. The investigation was a dead end. The artist was a loner. No enemies, no lovers. The building's security cameras showed no one entering or leaving her apartment around the time of death. It was a perfect, impossible crime. Riley couldn't sleep. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was connected to 12A Abercorn. But Eleonora's spirit was at peace. So what was this? Was it an echo, or was it something else entirely? He found Elias Vance in his dusty study. This time the old man's face was grim. He explained that pacifying Eleonora's spirit had been like calming a guard dog, but in doing so, they had left the gate it was guarding wide open. The house, a focal point of intense emotion for over a century, had become a conduit, a weak spot between worlds. Eleonora's ghost was merely the first prisoner, Detective, Vance said, his voice low. Now the cage is empty, but the door is unlocked. What you're dealing with now is what was locked outside. Something older, more primal. It doesn't have a story. It doesn't have grief. It only has hunger. It's drawn to sensitive souls, artists, people who can perceive it. The poor girl, she likely painted it into her life. Riley fought against the rising tide of supernatural dread. He tried to find a rational explanation, digging into the artist's life. He found her journal. She wrote about being drawn to the old house, about its tragic beauty. She had been sketching it for weeks. He went back to the house one more time. It was sealed, silent, but the feeling inside was different. Not angry, just empty, a waiting void. He went up to the second floor, to the room where Eleonora had been murdered, and he saw something he'd missed before. On the plaster wall, almost invisible, were faint scratch marks. They weren't letters, they were symbols, ancient, alien, and terrifyingly familiar. He photographed them and showed them to Vance. The old man dropped his pipe. "God help us," he whispered. "These are the marks of the hungering shadow, a parasitic entity that feeds on negative emotions. It has no face of its own, no true form. It becomes whatever its victim fears or desires most." Vance theorized that this entity had been imprisoned beneath the house's foundation centuries ago by a powerful root doctor. The century of Eleonora's torment and the final explosive release of her spirit had shattered the seal. Now it was free. "It won't stop with the artist," Vance warned. "It's tasted this world, and it will be drawn to anyone who was touched by the house's energy, anyone who opened their mind to it." A cold dread washed over Riley. People touched by the house. Mark, Julian, Ethan, and himself. Just then his phone rang. It was the warden from the state penitentiary. Ethan Cole was dead. He had used a shard of a broken mirror to carve the same alien symbols into the wall of his cell before taking his own life. Next to his body, guards found a scrap of paper. Scrawled on it in his own blood was a single word: help. A new chain of horror had begun. Riley knew this was no longer a murder investigation. He was a soldier in a war against an invisible enemy, and he was on the front line. That night, Riley sat alone in his office, the files for both cases spread before him. He felt a presence in the room, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. A soft tap on the door, but the hallway was empty. He looked at his dark computer screen, and in the reflection, he saw himself. But the man in the reflection wasn't him. It was a shadowy figure with no discernible features. and it was slowly raising its hand as if to reach through the glass. Riley drew his service weapon, aiming it squarely at the screen. His breath hitched. He knew running was futile. This thing didn't attack the body. It attacked the mind, feasting on fear until its victim self-destructed. The only way to fight it was to face it. He stood up, his eyes locked on the reflection. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steady. The shadow in the monitor didn't answer. Instead, it began to change. It morphed into the image of Sarah Jenkins, lying in the pool of black blood. Then into the artist, a knife in her chest. Then into Ethan Cole, his eyes wide and lifeless. Finally, it morphed into Riley himself, pressing the barrel of his own gun to his temple. A voice, not of this world, slithered into his mind. "Your fear, your guilt, your powerlessness, they are delicious." Riley squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to be calm. He remembered Vance's words, "It becomes what you fear." He could not give in. He opened his eyes, staring at his reflection at the gun aimed at his own head. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his real weapon. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, each word a stone thrown against the darkness. "You're nothing, a parasite, a shadow that only exists when I give you power." The image in the reflection flickered. The grotesque smile on its face faltered. The image began to distort like a bad TV signal. The voice in his head turned from a seductive whisper to an enraged shriek. Riley pressed on. "You've lost. I see you for what you are, and I will not feed you." He turned his back on the computer, walking out of his office, leaving the disintegrating shadow to its silent, furious scream. The war wasn't over. The hungering shadow was still out there, but tonight he had won a battle. He had discovered his only weapon, not a gun, not a charm, but the simple, powerful refusal to be afraid. He drove straight to 12A Abercorn Street. He stood before it, staring into its vacant windows. He no longer felt fear, only a resolve. As long as this house stood, this gateway would remain open. He would see to it that it was torn down, ground to dust, and replaced with something full of light and life. A park, perhaps. As he turned to leave, a gentle breeze stirred the humid air, carrying with it the faint, pure scent of magnolia blossoms. This time it wasn't cloying or foul. It was clean and peaceful, a quiet thank you from souls now at rest, and a silent promise that even after the longest, darkest night, the sun will eventually rise.